Our lecture today is going to be a review of all the material we've covered in the class so far. It is not intended as a replacement for reading the book. It is not a replacement for attending class or not paying attention in lectures or anything like that. There will also possibly be some material on the exam that is not covered in this review. So its only intention is to help you remember some of the things we covered earlier on in the semester. Our first lecture together was the roles of the artist, and there were 4 of them. You do not need to know them in any particular order, but the first role was that artists help us see the world in new and innovative ways. The example for this was The Gates by Christo. And this took place in 2005 in New York City, specifically Central Park. Christo and his wife Jean-Claude and their assistants made over 7,000 of these gates and spaced them around Central Park. The idea behind this work is that it made us look around again at our surroundings that have possibly become so mundane we didn't even see them anymore. We're experiencing Central Park anew for the first time. The second role of the artist is that artists record the world. And this is the idea of using art as documentation. And for me, this is so incredibly important because I want to be able to see the past. And that's what these artists do. They bring us back to events such as the burning of the Houses of Parliament, or we get to identify people such as Napoleon and visit areas like the Rocky Mountains. The third role of the artist is that artists give form to the immaterial. And the immaterial might be hidden or universal truths, spiritual forces such as God, and personal feelings such as like, love, or hate. This is, to me, the most difficult role for the artist because they have to have the power of imagination, creating something that doesn't truly exist physically. The fourth and last role of the artist is that artists make things beautiful. And for most of us, this is what we need artists to do, is we want to look and see and be surrounded by beautiful things. And my example on the study guide was this kimono. Then we went on to Italy in the 14th century. Some general things to keep in mind about the Renaissance is the word itself translates into rebirth. And this is exactly what happens as we emerge from the Dark Ages. It's an amazing time in both the development of the arts and the sciences. And the time period in which it began was around the year 1300, which is the early Renaissance. The 1400s were the middle Renaissance, and the 1500s is the late or high Renaissance. The Renaissance occurred all over Europe, even up in England. But specifically, we concentrated in 3 out of the 4 lectures on Italy. This is where the most incredible artists are working and producing. We started off in the city of Padua. By the time we got to the 1400s, we were in Florence. We moved down to Rome in the 1600s. And after the sack of Rome in 1527, we went back up north to Venice. Remember that this is a really difficult time in which to live. We don't have Europe existing as it does today with individual countries. We have a very loose political system. We have city-states. They're usually at battle with one another. It is a male-dominated society. We have religious persecution. We have warfare, famines, floods, and disease. The most important disease during this age is the plague, that wipes out nearly half of Europe's population. The painting medium during this age was tempera, and tempera is comprised of pigment and egg yolk. Tempera has been around for an incredibly long time, since the fall of the Roman Empire. And we see it a lot used on illuminated manuscripts, but also altarpieces. And we're also painting on wood. We haven't discovered oil paint yet. We're going to do that in the 1400s. And also we haven't utilized canvas yet. And that won't happen until the late 1400s. Make sure you're familiar with these two altarpieces and that you can tell me the differences between them. I will tell you Cimabue is the artist of the work at the left. Giotto, the very first artist of the Renaissance, is at the right. Cimabue was the teacher for Giotto in terms of painting. Giotto worked in his workshop and was an assistant. The time period between these two works is about 20 years, but Cimabue does represent the Byzantine or late Gothic Empire or style of painting. With Giotto's work at the right, we're looking at the term mimesis, which means to mimic or to reproduce. The best surviving works of Giotto occur at the Arena Chapel in Padua. It's called the Arena Chapel because it was built on the ruins of an ancient Roman arena. Inside we have a total of 37 different images from the life of the Virgin, the life of Christ, and we also have, as we exit the room, the Last Supper on the doorway wall. Some of the most important paintings would be like the meeting of Joachim and Anna, and this is sometimes called the meeting at the Golden Gate. We can see that Giotto's work is a complete departure from the late Gothic or Byzantine Empire, and we have characters that interact and show emotion. We have the idea that these are sculptural figures rather than flat figures. But still, there's some problems wrong with this scene. There's no shadows. Everything is equally bathed in light. We still don't have the technique of chiaroscuro down. We haven't invented linear perspective. So the building and the figures still look a little bit off. Now, as we transition away from this painting into the Last Judgment, we can see at the very base of this work, right underneath the cross, we have the patron, Enrico Scrivini, the person who paid Giotto, who commissioned Giotto to paint the inside of the Arena Chapel. He's offering the chapel itself to the Virgin Mary. And this was a totally acceptable way of buying your way into heaven, to, in a way, make up for the sins you committed in your life by doing this very religious act. The inside of the Arena Chapel is painted in what's called fresco. Fresco is the Italian word for fresh, and it refers to the fresh plaster that's being used to coat either the walls or the ceiling that's going to be then painted. Pigments are emulsified in lime water, and when they're painted onto the wet plaster, when the plaster dries, the pigment becomes part of the wall and is going to last for as long as that structure does. In the case of the Sistine Chapel, for instance, these images look just as good as they were when they were painted nearly 500 years ago. Fresco painting is normally done during the summer months so that the plaster will dry correctly. As with any type of painting, we try to work from the top to the bottom in order to prevent dripping from already completed sections. We do have a limited color palette because not all pigments are going to be water soluble. And keep in mind that fresco painting is very slow and methodical. A full-size figure, that could take 2 days to paint, and that's if you're moving at a very steady clip. The difference between fresco and fresco secco, which is another term you'll come across during the Renaissance, is that fresco secco is painting on plaster that has already dried. As you can imagine, is nowhere near as permanent as true fresco, but people would use this if deadlines were too close, if mistakes in true fresco were made, and it might be that even the weather cooled down to where traditional fresco painting wouldn't have been applicable. An example of something that is painted on dried fresco is The Last Supper by Da Vinci. Now, Da Vinci was not told to paint in fresco or anything like that. In fact, he wasn't even taught how to paint in fresco. This is a gigantic oil painting, about 15 feet by 30 feet in terms of size. But you can see in this example how ghostly these figures look. And we'll talk about this work shortly when we get to art of the 16th century. But I'm showing you this here because of the degradation that's going on with this painting. It looks horrible. It's in a very severe state of disrepair because it was just painted on the outside of the plaster. If this were done in true fresco, it would be as beautiful as the Sistine Chapel is today. So we have to think about who is paying for art during the Renaissance. I had mentioned Enrico Scrovini was the person who patronized Giotto. Well, we've got wealthy families definitely during this age, the Albizzi family, the Strazzis, Brancaccis, but most importantly, we've seen again and again throughout the chapters of the Medici family. Next, we look at the church as a patron of the arts. We've got popes such as Benedict XII, Clement VI, Innocent VII, Leo X, but again, we spend a lot of time with Julius II. He's the one that brings the most famed painters down to the Vatican during the 1500s. He's the one who rebuilds St. Peter's Cathedral. He's a very important individual in terms of art. We also have the guilds, and these were associations depending on what job that you had in Italy at the time. These were very much like our labor unions are today. And they would commission works as far as each of the guilds, trying to be very competitive to show the other guilds that they had money or influence or power. And we also have certain works being created and patronized for the city itself. For instance, the statue of David by Michelangelo, that was paid for by the city of Florence itself. David is, during the Renaissance, the patron saint of the city. We all briefly talked about the Maesta, and this was done in Siena, which you just saw the building, the Palazzo Pubblico, pop up over the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And the Maesta is made by Duccio. This is what's called a polyptych, which means that it is a multi-paneled art piece. So we've got about 40 different panels, and this work is absolutely gigantic. It was set in the middle of the cathedral in Siena, so you could see it from both sides. It wasn't like most altarpieces that are just up behind the altar. Here, it was set in the middle of the church. So some of the terms that we had were like triptych, which is a 3-paneled altarpiece, which you see very, very commonly. The polyptych, which is the multi-paneled. We have hieratic scale, which means that the largest person is the most important, or who you should focus on, and absolutely everyone here is focusing on the Madonna and Child. Sometimes that's called hierarchical scale. Mimesis means to mimic or to reproduce. And then we're going to move on to Italy during the 15th century. Now, this is where all the technical aspects of art are created, and that's a really important thing to note. In the 1300s, we're just emerging from the Dark Ages, and now here we're working on all the technical aspects that are going to be used for at least the next 500 years and still used today as well. But with the Florence Cathedral Baptistry, this is the building in front of the Florence Cathedral, and we started off this lecture talking about the commission for the doors. They were going to be made out of bronze. It was going to take 20 years to make them, and it came down really to 2 individuals. We've got Filippo Brunelleschi, who does the work at the right, and we also have Ghiberti, who does the work at the left. And make sure you're familiar with these 2 panels. The shapes of them are quatrefoil. And this is the sacrifice of Isaac as the subject matter. So you have Abraham taking out his only son Isaac to the woods to kill him, and just before he does so, this angel swoops down and tells Abraham that it was just a test of his faith. So we've got these two great panels. Make sure you know which one is the winning panel, and that of course is Ghiberti at the left, who then goes on not only to do these doors but also the north doors for the baptistry. And the reason he wins this contest is because that he creates his entire work from one piece of bronze, with the exception of the figure of Isaac, which is sculpted separately. Brunelleschi at the right, all of these figures are sculpted separately. He used a lot more bronze, and we learned that bronze is incredibly expensive. So that's why Ghiberti proved that technically he was the better artist of that work and in that medium. The cathedral complex is made up of three separate buildings: the baptistry, the cathedral itself, and also the bell tower. Make sure you know that Filippo Brunelleschi came back and completed the dome on the Florence Cathedral. That is where he is buried today, but he also created linear perspective. Brunelleschi also completed this work, this building, the Hospital of the Innocents, which is an orphanage in Florence. And a lot of times you'll hear it with the name Ospedale degli Innocenti. This is the very first building that's built in the Roman style in nearly 1,000 years. And people would gather on the worksite to see this building being created, with its use of Corinthian columns and arches, the pediments over the window, the arcade. The building is just fantastic, and it's the first building that is built with a blueprint, since Brunelleschi is across town, mostly building the dome on the Florence Cathedral. The Or San Michele was another building set in the oldest parts of Florence, and around here we have some of the best sculpture from the 15th century. These niches around the building were each had a saint, of the patron saint of a particular guild. And we have incredibly large bronze sculptures. This is the largest bronze sculpture created in the 1400s, of course, by Ghiberti. This is St. John the Baptist. We had this wonderful work of 4 marble sculptures of these sculptors during the Roman age who were put to death for refusing to make an image of a pagan god. And the last sculpture we're going to look at is Doubting Thomas by Verrocchio. And Verrocchio is famous because he is the teacher of Leonardo da Vinci. So we have this really cool sculptural set where Thomas is reaching in to feel the wound of Christ, and it is made out of bronze. The original sculptures around the Or San Michele, and there's 14 different niches of the patron saints for these guilds. The original sculptures are on the inside of the building. There are replicas on the outside today, but perhaps the most famous sculpture of this age, of this century, is the statue of David by Donatello. It is the first time in 1,000 years that we have a bronze, full-sized sculpture, and sculpture in the round, of a male nude figure. What happens here also is that Donatello has looked to the past, has looked to the classical age, and brought forth the idea of contrapposto, which we actually see in this sculpture by Hermes and Dionysus, that natural weight shift. And that sculpture at the right is Greek. It dates back to around 350 BC, but you see that natural curve, that weight shift to the body, where the hips and legs are in a different direction than the shoulders and the head. And so you have that more lifelike, dynamic appearance. Keep in mind, though, you're going to have this image set most likely on the midterm, almost 100% guaranteed, where you have a compare and contrast between these two figures. We have a very young David at the left compared to one in his early 20s at the right. We have different mediums such as marble and bronze. We have the height differences. Donatello's David is 5'2". The one by Michelangelo is 17 feet. We have a private commission with Donatello for the Medici family. We don't even know exactly when this sculpture is completed because we do have this appearing on an inventory list from the Medici courtyard is where it was placed. Whereas the work at the right was a commission by the city of Florence itself, originally intended to be put on top of the Florence Cathedral, but once unveiled was thought to be so beautiful it was set out in front of the seat of government, the Palazzo Vecchio. During this age, we're also considering how do we depict space on a two-dimensional surface, which we call piercing the pictorial plane. The pictorial plane is just the surface of a piece of paper, it's the surface of a canvas, and we want to make that image look three-dimensional. We can do so through scale, overlapping, vertical location, atmospheric perspective, amplified perspective or foreshortening, and linear perspective. So with scale, here it is, objects that are closer to us appear larger than those farther away. And in that image at the left where we have these trees running down the snow-covered road, we can see that they diminish in size as they move further away from us. Even though this is a flat surface, that gives us the illusion of depth as if we are able to move down that snow-covered pathway. With overlapping, we have figures in front, overlapping, covering, hiding objects further away. For instance, the apple juice in the lower left-hand corner covers part of the Fiji water bottle. The Perrier bottle over at the right covers part of the Evian bottle. In irises, we've got vertical location, meaning that the higher the object is, the further recessed it is, the further away from us it is. And we see that a lot in Eastern cultures. When we start adding the term perspective, things get a lot more complex. But with this image here, we've got this really cool mountain chain behind us. You can see how clear, crisp, and well-defined the foreground is. But as we move from right to left along the background, those mountains become more fuzzy, more hazy. The color starts to change. So the official definition of atmospheric perspective is the further away the object is, the contours become less distinct, and they start to take on the color of the atmosphere. And I told you during our lecture on color about how the value change is really important here. At the foreground, we have some very severe value change, but toward the distance here, especially off to the far left, we have very little value change, and that makes our eye push that more toward the distance. With amplified perspective or foreshortening, the figure of Christ has been shortened, it's been distorted, it's been raised up out of true linear perspective, so we can see the body of Christ, we can see the wounds, but if this was done in true, what we would consider linear perspective or scientific perspective, we wouldn't have been able to see his body because his feet would have been blocking our view. Amplified perspective or foreshortening is something that's very rare. It's kind of one of those images here that you see that you kind of memorize because this is the main one we saw during the semester that had foreshortening. It's very difficult for the artist to attain this, and it brings the viewer very much into the painting at a very odd and unique angle. But I want to make sure you are very comfortable with linear perspective. It is the most convincing way of representing that three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface because it's a math problem. It was invented by Brunelleschi in the 1400s, And what happens is once it's invented, it becomes the gold standard that artists have to follow and live up to, at least until the 1800s, which is we're going to see a switch to modern art at that point, and we'll discuss that after the midterm. The theory of linear perspective is pretty simple. It's that parallel lines appear to converge on or emerge from a single point in the distance, and that point is called the vanishing point. Masaccio, who does this work here, is the very first artist to employ linear perspective in a painting. And we can prove that this work is in linear perspective by using the architectural elements, such as the coffered ceiling on the barrel vault behind the crucifixion. And even though it looks parallel, those lines look parallel, they're not. They're slightly tapered, and they're going to meet at that point. That point is called the vanishing point, and the vanishing point lives on the horizon line. So when we prove something is in linear perspective, we do the exact opposite in terms of when we want to create it. And I can say definitely almost every single painting done after the 1430s up until 1863 is going to be done in linear perspective because it gives us that three-dimensional world, the idea of mimesis, replicating the natural world. With the tribute money, and this is a really cool painting because it deals with the idea of taxation, particularly toward the clergy in the 1400s. Christ and the apostles arrive at Capernaum, and they're confronted by a Roman tax gatherer for their half drachma tribute. Christ tells Peter to go to the Lake of Galilee. There's a fish with a coin in its mouth, and we see at the far right Peter paying the tax collector. Masaccio is one of those that inspired Michelangelo, even though they didn't live at the same time. Michelangelo, as a young boy, would go to the Brancacci Chapel in Florence and copy the works of Masaccio, including the tribute money. But what happens with Masaccio's painting here is that this is our complete departure from the 1300s. Now we have a light source. These figures show shadows. We have chiaroscuro that's been developed, so the figures are shaded and modeled to form more truly sculptural figures. We have some atmospheric perspective in the background. That building at the right is in linear perspective. This is all about technical aspects of art being created during the Middle Renaissance. The Birth of Venus is our very first painting done on canvas. And the Primavera, another work by Botticelli. And we're going to move to Italy in the 16th century, where we have the greatest artists, such as Leonardo da Vinci. And of course, his work, The Last Supper, which we spent a lot of time on. Absolutely in linear perspective. We talked about the Mona Lisa. We also have Raphael, one of our young artists during the High Renaissance. And he's most famous for these Madonna and Child images, although they don't appear as a true Madonna and Child like we have with Giotto. We barely see a little bit of an arc from the halo around the Madonna. And we do have a church in the background, but that's the only religious elements that we have. So not at all like the altarpieces we saw earlier, about 200 years previous. It's much more like a Madonna and Child or a Mother and Child image that we have by Mary Cassatt from the more modern age. And as we move into this 100-year segment, we're seeing the transition from technical aspects to artists that have now began to experiment. Da Vinci experimented with the Mona Lisa. It's a different way of portraiture. Raphael creating a different view of the Madonna and Child. And he worked for several different important individuals, from government officials on up to religious individuals, such as Pope Julius II, who has him paint his personal library, where we have this painting, which originally is called Philosophy, but more commonly we see it the School of Athens, where we have the most famous philosophers, naturalists, astronomers, mathematicians gathered in one group here. Raphael gives many of these individuals the faces of his contemporary friends. We also have down at the very center portion, just off-center to the left, Michelangelo leaning on a block of marble. And speaking of Michelangelo, he is definitely the most famous sculptor and painter of this age. He creates the Pietà around the age of 25. Remember that this does get damaged in the 1970s by someone coming into St. Peter's Cathedral with a sledgehammer. And the Statue of David, his most famous work and one of the more seminal works of the Italian Renaissance. David is the patron saint of Florence, and it is about 17 feet high. Now, of course, Michelangelo's fame spreads throughout Italy. It doesn't just stay in Florence. And the Pope commissions Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Once the fall of Rome occurs in 1527, the last remaining artists are those up in Venice. And we've got people like Giorgione and Titian. And this work we'll come back to when we start to study modern art, as Manet makes this work more contemporary with his painting called Olympia. One of the few altarpieces that is still in situ in its original location up in Venice. And Veronese's great painting, Feast in the House of Levi, which originally was a Last Supper painting, and it's absolutely gigantic. It's 18 feet high, it's 42 feet across, and it upset the Inquisition as Christ was placed around, quote, Germans, drunkards, and dwarves. And so Veronese was forced to change the painting. But with the size of the painting, he was very smart and just changed the name so that it linked to a different story in the Bible, the Feast in the House of Levi. We also spent some time talking about the Madonna of the Long Neck, which is our work that is Mannerist in style. And we talked about all the things that were wrong with it. The baby was the wrong size and perhaps the wrong age. It looked dead. We had the Graces off to the left, the Madonna wearing jewelry. We have the short individual, Saint Jerome, in the background, completely out of scale. We have columns rising up to nothing. We have a Madonna in a half-sitting, half-rising position. So it's a very unique painting and definitely one that you want to attach the term Mannerist to. But remember that Mannerism also can be attributed to Michelangelo's Last Judgment here at the right. We can see that in Giotto's work at the left, everyone is lined up, everything is symmetrical. The saved are to Christ's right, the damned and hell are to Christ's left. But in Michelangelo's work, everything is chaotic. When we visited Northern Europe, we found out that this was an area called Flanders, which incorporated areas today, countries today, such as France and Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Here, though, is where we met Jan van Eyck, and also with the invention of oil paints. This painting is very important with all the symbolism and iconography in it, letting us know the true story of these individuals. When oil paint's invented, it truly does revolutionize painting. Up until now, we've been painting with ways of encaustic, fresco, and also tempera. All those mediums would dry very, very quickly. Oil paints are far more adaptable and versatile than these other mediums. And by the year 1500, it's going to totally replace tempera as an artistic medium. The largest advantage of oil paints is that they are incredibly slow to dry. We can rework paintings for days, weeks, even months, and we don't have to worry about leaving the paint out on the palette overnight. It's really a terrific medium. Oil paint can also be applied in layers. We'll see that when we go into the Van Gogh lecture later in the semester. We have gestural freedom. Think about the image of Starry Night by Van Gogh, where we can see the pathway the brush took in the night sky. And we can also blend oil paint to create a continuous scale of colors, so there's no color absences in oils. Jan van Eyck and his brother were two of the individuals who helped to fix the chemicals that created oil paint. This is a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck here. And this is the famed Ghent altarpiece. And we're not sure exactly which brother did which parts of this altarpiece. Some say Jan did all of the painting while the other brother created the wood frame. Other accounts are completely different. But this is a very large altarpiece, 11 feet high and about 15 feet in terms of width. And we also talked about this during the art theft lecture, where this had been stolen 13 times in its 600-year existence. The Merode altarpiece, much more of a common altarpiece that we would find in Northern Europe. With the exception of the Ghent altarpiece, which is incredibly large, the Northern Europe art is much smaller but very much detailed. So we have at the left here, we have the patrons of the work of art. In the center of the work, we have the Annunciation. And over at the right, we have Joseph creating a pressboard for grapes and wine. Here we also talked about the different types of printmaking processes available to an artist. We had the relief process, which prints from the positive area, where we can get woodcuts, wood engravings, and linocuts. They're all very similar. Woodcuts are basically utilizing a piece of wood to draw the design on, and then negative space is gouged or hammered out. And the problem that we have with woodcuts, though, is that many times the grain of the wood plays a major part in the finished work, as we see in the lower right. The work at the left is from the Renaissance age. It has been hand-colored. There are other processes that are created to color woodcuts. Most of them that you will see are going to be black and white, but do know that they can be printed in color as well. With wood engravings, we're using a different cut of wood instead of like a standard cut that you would see at like one of the home improvement stores where it's like you would have a 2x4. Here we have a much more vertical cut where we've got the actual rings of the tree making up the wood. Here it eliminates any lines that could be caused by the grain, and it gives us a photographic-like quality image, but wood engravings are very rare, as are linocuts. Linocuts, instead of using wood, we're using linoleum, and linoleum is very soft, so it is easy to carve, but every time it goes through a press, the image starts to get distorted. So great for short print runs, great for class projects, horrible for if we need 100 prints. And now we're going to talk about the intaglio process. The intaglio process also has 3 subcategories: engravings, etchings, and dry points. But the intaglio process works opposite of the relief process. Instead of the image that's transferred being raised, here it's actually sunken into the metal plate. Engravings, these were used to reproduce works of art, as we see in this image below of J.M.W. Turner's painting at the right, and then the engraving at the left. And they were also used to illustrate books prior to the invention of photography, which took place in 1839, and we'll talk about that during the second part of the class as well. Engravings are created when we push a burin across a piece of metal. We scoop up this little sliver, and that's what creates the line. the ink settles into the line, and then that's what transfers the image. With dry points, instead of pushing the burren, we pull it back toward us so that that sliver of metal is not removed but pushed up on either side of the line that we're creating. And this works very much like lina cuts do in terms of short print runs. Because the metal that we're using is very soft, every time this goes through the press, it distorts the image, and we get a short print run. But dry points, like lina cuts, are very rare. But we do see a lot of etchings, and we saw the video in class of the snake artist creating his work. But the etching is created with acid. The top of the piece of zinc or copper is covered with this wax-like material. We draw through the wax, exposing the plate with a stylus, which you see in the image at the left, and then the plate is placed into an acid bath, and that's what physically creates the line. All the processes are inked and printed the same. Keep in mind with the intaglio process, it leaves an indentation with the paper. So you can see the series number in the left, you can see the title of the work in the center and the artist's signature to the right, but you see kind of that indentation above that and along the edges. When we print with the intaglio process, we moisten the sheet of paper that we're printing on as well. And when it goes through the press, it literally wraps around the printing plate, and that's what causes the indentation. We want to look for this indentation because that equals money to us. Intaglio printing is very much collected and deserves a higher price. And now let's move on to the Baroque. With the Baroque, this is the time period of the 1600s. And we're going to not only be in Italy, but we're also going to be more throughout Europe, visiting areas such as Holland, France, and Spain. We do have the same patrons as the Renaissance during this age, but a totally new batch of artists. When we look at an altarpiece from the Renaissance, we can see that this painting is very linear. We have forms that are solid and three-dimensional. We utilize the technique of chiaroscuro. The composition is closed, meaning everything happens within the composition. And light falls evenly. We don't have any highlighting per se. But when we get to the Baroque, forms and outlines tend to merge, and it's very difficult to tell where one ends and the next one begins. A tremendous amount of diagonals, and as we learned in our lecture about line, diagonals indicate motion, dynamism. We have a seemingly greater amount of depth to these paintings, and we have emphasis on light, color, and shadow. We move beyond chiaroscuro to this technique called tenebrism. St. Peter's Cathedral is one of the central points of the Baroque. Keep in mind that this church is a conglomeration of different artists and architects. The facade is created by Carlo Maderno, and it's based on the Church of Santa Susanna. The dome is designed by Michelangelo. The central plan of the church by the architect Bramante. And the arms of the church, sometimes called the double arcade, by the artist Bernini. When we go inside the church, we also have Bernini completing the baldacchino, which marks the grave of St. Peter. And this sculpture of David, also by Bernini. And we can see that, unlike Donatello or Michelangelo's version, we have a different part of the story where this person is right about to swing that slingshot that's going to knock out Goliath. And we've got him, David, in a pretty much wound up position, very much using diagonals to show the idea of motion. Bernini also completed this gigantic sculpture and architecture piece called Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. These figures are roughly life-size out of marble. While Bernini was probably the most famed sculptor of the Baroque, Caravaggio was the most famed painter, and he had a heightened sense of realism and dramatic lighting, along with theatrical elements to his paintings. He was very popular among young artists because he was radical. However, more established artists did not like him very much. They called him an omen of the ruin and demise of painting. He was even referred to as the Antichrist of painting. He did have temper issues, and he ends up killing another artist in a bar fight, and he's forced to leave Rome and travel around southern Italy for the last 4 years of his life. His paintings are similar to Raphael in terms of the ambiguity or vagueness that these are religious paintings. Here, Christ off to the right with a very vague halo around his head points to St. Matthew, but we're even unsure which of these figures to the left are Matthew. With the conversion of St. Paul, we've got another painting that is very unique in terms of its religion. With the conversion of St. Paul, this is another painting that has vagueness as far as its religious connotations. It looks like an accident where someone has slid off of a horse. We have no indication that there is religion present in this painting, but it does serve as an altarpiece. One of the followers of Caravaggio was Artemisia Gentileschi. And we also have famed Spanish artist Diego Velázquez during this age. Now, where I said earlier on that Renaissance paintings were closed, this is an example of a Baroque painting that is open, meaning that the subject matter could lie outside of the frame of the image. And here we have the family of King Philip IV of Spain, but the king and queen might be outside of this painting. They or us might be the focal point. So when you have a painting like this that definitely can have multiple focal points, from the gentleman at the back stairs, the little girl in the center, even the dog has been argued as the focal point along with the painter. It could be us. It could be the king and queen. Works like this are considered afocal, which means that we can't determine a focal point. Rubens and Rembrandt were also painters of this age. And Vermeer was a Dutch painter. This is a painting of Vermeer's wife as she's pregnant with their child, and we see her weighing earthly goods with an image of the Last Judgment behind with the weighing of souls. We had a lecture also on art theft, looting, and repatriation. The reasons that stealing art has become so popular has been money, ease, the size and shape of these artworks make them conducive to stealing, and the general lack of enforcement around art. The Art Loss Register is a database that houses over 200,000 works of art that auction houses are required to search before putting an item up for sale. We talked about art that was degenerate, which was modern art. This is a term that Hitler applied to this style of art, even though we haven't talked about modern art yet in this course, that the idea that this art is showing signs of decline, that it's lost the physical, mental, or moral qualities considered to be normal and desirable. In 1937, Hitler signs the Degenerate Art Act, and this allows Nazi troops to go into Germany's state museums to quote-unquote cleanse them of works that the Fuhrer deems as poisonous. And again, this is modern artworks that they're taking. They're taking them up to Switzerland. They're going to be sold at auction, the funds to benefit the Third Reich. Works we saw stolen during this time were Da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine, The most important artwork still missing from the Second World War is this self-portrait of Raphael. The Ghent altarpiece. And we also talked about art theft in America. At the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, this work is among the 13 that were stolen that are all considered priceless works of art, all stolen on March 18th, 1990. Insurance value on these 13 paintings topped over $500 million. It's been 30 years and none of the paintings have been recovered. And then our last portion of the class, we studied French art of the 18th and 19th centuries. We talked about the Salon, and this is an event held every year by the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris. This is where the very best work from the artists of that school were put on display for the public to see. And the location of the Salon of the School of Fine Arts is the Louvre. And you can see that it's very different from a museum experience. These paintings are placed frame to frame in these rooms. The first style of art we talked about was Rococo. And again, we're located in France. This art movement or art style begins in 1715 with the beginning of the reign of Louis XV, and it ends abruptly with the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. This is artwork that was supported by the aristocracy, and their image was very much reflected in their artwork. We had terms such as RA, after a painter's name, that stands for Royal Academy, and Prix de Rome, which is a scholarship given to promising art students, which allows them to study in Rome for 3 to 5 years. This is an example of Rococo art. Watteau and also Fragonard were two of the most famous painters of this style. We can see that there's imagery of sensuality, sexuality, leisure, opulence, all present in these paintings. When we get to neoclassical art, this is kind of the art that replaced Rococo when the French Revolution began. And these paintings reflected classical ideals as their subject matter. So make sure that you know paintings such as The Oath of the Horatii by David and the story behind this work, because this will definitely be one that will be on the exam. Jacques-Louis David is the most famous painter of the neoclassical age. He was also a court painter and friend of Napoleon. And he also completes The Death of Marat. Then we went to Romanticism. And Romanticism is something that existed side by side with neoclassicism. It's the exploration of emotion, expression, and imagination. The subject matter occurred from a variety of sources, including literature, current events, and even the artist's own imagination. The Raft of the Medusa is probably the most famous and definitely the seminal work of the Romantic era. Again, this is one of the images you need to know the story about. The Oath of the Horatii that we saw earlier really spurred on the French Revolution. But unfortunately, the French Revolution fails, and we have the monarchy that returns to power. And this tells us about the corruption that was in the monarchy, and it caused a whole bunch of deaths of these innocent individuals because of that corruption. You also saw a short video on Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix. And also this is where we had the lithographic printing process. And this is a great printing process for the common artist because we're freehand drawing onto this block of limestone. There's a tremendous amount of advantages with lithography. We have a flat printing surface, which also means that there's no parts of it that can be worn down. So the first print that we make is just as good as the 100th or 1000th print that we make. We don't need any special talent to create the image. Mistakes are easily corrected. Thousands of prints instead of tens or hundreds, and the lithographic stone can be reused. This is another work that you need to know the story behind. This is a true event that happened April 15th, 1834. We also talked about Goya during this age. And here's his portrait of the King Charles IV and his family. Very similar to Las Meninas by Velázquez. And then we ended our lecture talking about realism. And realism is a very short-lived artistic style that kind of showed the modern world as it was, usually with laborers and a very much identifiable landscape and figures. Although realism is going to be cut short by the invention of photography, which is something we will discuss at the beginning of the new part of the semester. And with that, that's going to end our review. Best of luck on the midterm exam.